I'm Beau Johnson. It's December 26, 2025. Welcome to YesToHellWith.com. In the year 1931, 9 black boys, some as young as 13, were riding a freight train in northern Alabama during the Great Depression. They were poor. They were transient. They were doing what desperate people did to survive. They were looking for work. A fight broke out on the train. When the train stopped in Scottsboro, Alabama, the boys were arrested. Only after the arrest did the accusation arise. White girls, 2 of them, accused the boys of rape. And in the Jim Crow South, that accusation carried a predetermined outcome. Doctors examined the girls. They found no evidence of rape. This should have ended the case. It did not. Mobs gathered outside the jail demanding executions. The National Guard was called in, not to protect justice, but to prevent lynching. That matters, because once a court operates under racial fear and public threat, it is no longer neutral. It becomes defensive, and defensive courts do not protect the accused. The boys were rushed to trial. They were given lawyers with no time to prepare. Trials lasted hours. Juries were all white. Verdicts were swift. 8 of the 9 boys were sentenced to death, not because guilt was proven, but because the South demanded resolution, not truth. Now, let's consider the 4 corners of justice diagram from top to bottom. The electorate. The public atmosphere was racially inflamed. Justice took a back seat to appeasement. Investigators. Medical evidence contradicted the accusation, but the evidence was ignored. The prosecutors. The case was driven forward despite knowing the evidence did not support it. The judge. The court allowed speed, pressure, and racial tension to override fairness. The defense counsel existed in name only. There was no meaningful preparation. Witnesses. False testimony prevailed over medical facts. And the jury, all white in the Jim Crow South, and they delivered the expected verdicts, guilt, and sentences of death. Grand jury, the indictments proceeded even though there was no provable injured party. Every restraint failed. Every safeguard collapsed. The system didn't malfunction. It worked as designed under racial pressure. Years passed. Convictions were overturned, then reinstated, then overturned again. One of the accusers later admitted the story of the rape was false. Still, the boys remained imprisoned, some for decades. This is why the Supreme Court of the United States had to intervene, because local justice could not be trusted to correct itself. In Powell versus Alabama, the court acknowledged what was obvious. These boys were never meaningfully defended. Later, the court acknowledged another truth, that black citizens had been systematically excluded from juries. Even then, justice came slowly. The last defendant wasn't released until 1950. Formal pardons did not arrive until 2013, long after most of the men were dead. The Scottsboro Boys were not victims of a simple legal error. They were victims of a system operating inside a racially charged environment where fear replaced judgment and procedure replaced truth. This is why the 4 corners of justice diagram matters, not as theory, not as abstraction, but as a way to see clearly and unmistakably when a system has stopped protecting the innocent and started protecting itself and engineering convictions time and time again without cause. The Scottsboro Boys were not criminals. They were processed. And whenever accusation replaces proof, whenever pressure replaces restraint, whenever courts value closure over justice, the Scottsboro story is no longer history. It is a warning. For regardless of who we are today, regardless of our race, the justice system does so often today what it did back then to the Scottsboro Boys. It is an unrelenting machine, hell-bent on incarcerating Americans. For what? Well, the four corners of justice diagram tells us what and why. And as always, may truth reign supreme.